going. So welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us. On behalf of the State Higher Education Executive Officers and the Association of American Colleges and Universities, I want to thank you for joining us for today's webinar on the Multi-State Collaborative to Advance Learning Outcomes Assessment. It's a project involving 9 states, the State Higher Education Executive Officers Association, and the Association of American Colleges and Universities. Connecticut, Indiana, Kentucky, Massachusetts, Minnesota, Missouri, Oregon, Rhode Island, and Utah are collaborating to develop and pilot test a model for state system learning outcomes assessment that is rooted in campus and multi-campus collaboration, focused on authentic student work, and useful to faculty for improving teaching and curricula. Today's webinar is to provide an overview of the development and use of the AAC&U value rubrics. I'm Chris Ott, and I'll be your SHIO webinar operator for this presentation. Before I hand it over to our presenter, please allow me to cover a few housekeeping items. Time will be provided for questions and answers at the end of the presentation. You should see a primary presentation window on your screen, as well as a selection of windows on the right-hand side. One of those windows should say Q&A. This is where you can type any questions during or at the end of the presentation. To ask a question at any time, just type it into the small white box at the bottom of the Q&A window. After typing your question, press Enter, and your question will be submitted to all the presenters. Questions will appear in a queue in the order in which they're received. Presenters will respond to as many questions as possible during the Q&A period at the end of the webinar using the audio system so that everybody can hear the answers. If you ask a technical question about the webinar itself during the presentation, I might be able to respond to you directly by text through the same system. To help us gauge the effectiveness of our webinars, we're trying to get an accurate count of our participants. So if you're sharing this webinar with someone else using a single connection, would you please let us know by sending us a note in the Q&A window indicating how many additional people are joining you? Thank you. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our presenters today, Terry Rhodes and Ashley Finley. And with that, I'd like to give you Terry.
Thank you, Chris. And let me add my welcome to all of you who are participating in the webinar today. We see that there's a large contingent of folks from Missouri, and I love that you're doing this as a collaborative effort. And also would like to welcome Akihiro Ihara, who is our colleague in Japan, who has gotten up very early in the morning to attend this webinar. So we welcome him and appreciate the interest that is growing in Japan for this approach to assessing student learning as well. We have tried to, Ashley and I have tried to organize this webinar around a set of questions, because as we have worked over the years with campuses in a variety of contexts around using value rubrics, certain questions continue to arise over and over again, and so we thought we would try to use that as a key toward where to focus our attention during this webinar. But again, as Chris indicated, if you have additional questions, please do ask those so that we can respond to them at the end of the webinar or follow up later through email. And the first question is really, how were the value rubrics developed? They were created with some funding from two funders in particular, the Fund for Improvement of Post-Secondary Education in the U.S. Department of Education and State Farm Foundation Industries Foundation. And that collaboration there in terms of funding indicates as well part of the motivation, I think, and part of the appeal of the value approach. It was not only something that public entities that are interested in education and the quality of education saw as something that could be of use, but also that employers, the industry, the folks that are hiring our graduates when they leave us, also saw some real usefulness in this kind of approach to the learning that students needed and wanted to support something that was going to give them more valuable information as they were trying to determine who to hire, as they came from our institutions, that they weren't getting from the existing measures at that time. It was also, though, very much driven by the release of the Spellings Commission report that I think many of you are familiar with and have heard about, that was looking at the future of higher education. And we were joined by many in terms of having some real worries and questions about that report because there was virtually no mention of faculty in this report on the future of higher education, and we thought there's something fundamentally wrong when faculty and other educational professionals are not mentioned as being central to the quality of a higher education and the learning that is going to occur as a result of that in looking into the future. It was also at a time when the nation was in the midst of implementing No Child Left Behind in the K-12 arena that was very heavily driving instruction in the pre-collegiate time period toward student performance and judgments based upon a series of tests. And many in higher education thought that there was a lot of pressure in policy circles and legislative bodies to move higher education in that same direction. And an overwhelming sense that there had to be some alternative that could be pursued. And so that's what really motivated AAC&U to propose a different approach to assessing student learning, and to do it not on a narrow set of outcomes that were the primary focus of most of the existing standardized tests at that time back in 2007-2009 period, but on the broad range of learning outcomes that decades of working and talking with faculty and other educational professionals on campuses had told us that they were interested in, so that it included a much broader array of outcomes. And so what we decided to do was to see if indeed we could collect teams of faculty and educational professionals from all kinds of institutions, from all parts of higher education, to collaborate together to develop and articulate what the learning looked like across 16 of the essential learning outcomes that educators and employers were telling us were critical, and that this not be restricted to particular disciplines or particular institutional sectors, but could be articulated in a general broad context around what is shared, regardless of the kind of institution or where a particular individual sat or worked within a higher education institution. So these teams indeed developed the rubrics through a process of looking at existing rubrics and the research in each of the 16 outcome areas, and drafted the articulation of those shared learning outcomes and the levels at which students would perform or they would expect students to perform as they move through our institutions and among our institutions. And these were then tested by a whole, well over 100 institutions where faculty had said, we want to try these out with our own students' work and see how they work. They gave feedback, the teams revised, and so it went through several of these cycles for the rubrics to try to enhance them and make them more understandable, more valuable, and more useful. And then finally, these rubrics are indeed and were developed at the institutional level. So they are general. They are at a higher level of generality than many rubrics are that have been developed for classroom, at the classroom level. But that was intentional because that was what we were being asked to use standardized tests for at that time. And so we wanted it to be comparable in the sense of having it be at an institutional or programmatic level, which by necessity made it be more general. But that we expected institutions, because of the diversity of institutions in the U.S. higher education system, needed to be responsive to the mission, the program mix, and the particular students that institutions had. And so we expected these to be modified to reflect those differences. But as long as they were within this broad framework of criteria, et cetera, that they would still have the ability to see their work and their students' learning in a broader context. And that if the rubrics then were to be utilized at a more refined or focused level at a set of courses, that they could be again modified to be able to be used in a classroom level for more specified grading in a particular content area or focus of a particular course. And so that's sort of the how they were developed and the thinking behind it in the initial stages of this that led up to the release of the rubrics in 2009. And we made them available free of charge on our website for campuses to have at. And that's what's been happening since then. And I'm going to turn it over to Ashley to talk about what has happened since then. Ashley?
Thanks, Terry, and hello to all of you out there, and thanks from me for taking the time to join us today. It's really a great opportunity to have the chance to, well, at least share a little bit about what we know about the rubrics and certainly the feedback that we've been getting from campuses. But as we go through the slides, I would absolutely encourage all of you to think about how the rubrics have been or might be applied in your own campus context, and any questions that you have, and we'll certainly try to save time at the end to get to some of those questions. So one of and I routinely say this when I'm on campus, is one of our biggest challenges with the rubrics is in fact keeping up with the ways in which they're being used across the country and actually internationally as well. One of the ways in which we have at least some information that goes beyond anecdotal and what we might learn from conferences and other connections with campus partners is through web analytics. One of the ways that we've done this is just by analyzing the number of people that have visited the website, and actually these are, what you're seeing here are page views, and so we just to give a snapshot of the increasing at least interest, I guess we would say, over time in the rubrics, and this has just been steadily rising over time. The next thing that we know from this and analyzing just some of those data is the diversity and range of institutions and organizations that have accessed the rubrics. And for example, we know that the vast majority of people, of course, that are accessing the rubrics are at institutions of higher education, but we also have a range of K through 12 schools and systems that have accessed those. Anything from government organizations, for-profit and non-profit associations have certainly taken a look at those. I've had a conversation with somebody from the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry wanting to know how to apply one of the rubrics with his staff. So there's been this has sparked an interesting chord with people across the country and really trying to think about how these might relate. One of the things also is that the Voluntary System for Accountability has approved the use of rubrics a few years ago for use in accountability reporting, and so we thought of that as a nice stamp of approval. But this just gives you a snapshot of what we know about how campuses are accessing the rubrics. I might mention here that if you access any of the rubrics now, we have actually developed a new system for keeping some better, tracking a little bit better way and getting a little bit better information on how the rubrics are actually being downloaded. And so what you'll notice now, if you have been to the site in the last few months, you'll notice that you basically have a virtual shopping cart, and you're putting the rubrics into a virtual shopping cart in which you're checking out for free because the rubrics are still free. But bear with us in that process. We are trying to streamline it a little bit more quickly, but that's purely being done for the use of getting much better information on how the rubrics are actually being used and downloaded. So one of the reasons that we think the usability and interest in the rubrics has steadily been increasing over time is in fact because what the rubrics are doing is getting at a source of assessment that we're simply in need of on our campuses. We have quite a lot of data on any of our campuses, quite a lot of information that is indirect regarding student learning. We have lots and lots of data, and I'm imagining many of you out there sort of nodding your heads. Lots and lots of data on what students think about their learning, how they perceive the experience of learning, how they perceive the kinds of information that they receive. And we have far fewer bits of evidence, if any, to suggest the ways in which students are actually demonstrating their learning in ways that actually capture not only the learning outcomes that we care about at the institutional level, but also the progress and development of that learning over time. And the rubrics attempt to do that. So we think that is that is also a key part here. And then certainly the ability for institutions to use those data for processes of improvement. We also think that this form of assessment has driven interest in large part because it's faculty owned and gets at, again, what I just mentioned, institutionally shared outcomes that connect or align with the mission statement, align with strategic planning, connect with course goals and program goals, particularly when you look beyond content in those programs, things around need for communication, need to think critically, and also civic responsibility. So the idea that faculty remain the experts in how to assess student work and student learning is central to this form of assessment, and I think that's been shown in the amount of interest that's developed over time. Also, the fact that the rubrics were created specifically not just for institutional assessment, but also for students' own self-assessment of their learning. And in part, the intentionality of the revision process was to strip the rubrics as much as possible from the jargon that we tend to layer in as academics and make them more accessible for a wider audience, and that wider audience certainly included students. So the ability to be actually able to use them for multiple layers and types of assessment on campus was critical. And going along with students' own self-assessment, but then also for the degrees of faculty development and faculty learning and staff learning that's happening across our campuses, just the articulation in the rubrics has created great opportunities to increase transparency around outcomes that are salient at the institutional level, and providing some much needed language for how to communicate those goals to multiple stakeholders on campus, including students, faculty, and staff. I'll turn it back over to Terry.
Thank you. This slide simply lists for you what the existing value rubrics cover. We did not develop value rubrics for the first category there of knowledge of human cultures, physical, natural worlds, because we felt that the content areas were pretty well covered, if not by rubrics covering those particular areas, by exams and other ways in which faculty and educational professionals already have focused primarily upon those content areas and knowledge areas. And so we did not go there, but rather focused our attention on the other three categories of intellectual practical skills, personal and social responsibility, and integrative and applied learning. The newest value rubric is actually global learning under personal and social responsibility, and that came about because of a sort of a groundswell among faculty on various campuses saying that the intercultural knowledge and competence wasn't sufficient, that a global learning rubric was indeed important and critical for institutions to have because of the renewed interest in the global dimensions of higher education. And so it went through the same process as the original 15 did. And that's why we now have 16 value rubrics. And again, the web address is there if you haven't already accessed them. The rubrics that were developed did indeed follow a set of guidelines to be able to have some interoperability and some commonality in terms of the design for the value rubrics. Initially, it was the faculty on the development teams who said we need to have a front page for the rubrics. And often when campuses begin to explore the rubrics and want to enter into things like calibration and norming sessions, they skip over this page. But we and the faculty developers felt so strongly that there needed to be this front page for each of the rubrics. So what you'll find is the same basic format. Each of them starts out with a sort of boilerplate explanation of what a value rubric is, etc. And each is followed by a definition, because again, the developers felt very strongly that it was that users needed to know how they had conceived of and defined the learning outcome in the context of this rubric, so that if they had particular emphases or aspects of the learning that were particularly important because of their mission, that they could indeed be aware of that and think about that in the context of whether they did want to or needed to modify the rubric when they began to use it. There's also a section on framing language that tries to point individuals to, again, the reasoning and the part of the process that went behind the meaning of the rubric for them. Often includes some of the research that was looked at. And so that also is a part of it. The last part, the glossary at the bottom, the developers were asked to avoid using jargon and terminology that was so focused on a particular learning outcome arena that general users would have to struggle in being able to use it, because all of us, when in our own professional context, develop a language that separates us from our other colleagues who are in other professions. And we were trying to keep that to a minimum because the rubrics were designed to be used by anyone across the campus in the academic as well as the student affairs arena, etc. And so we tried to keep the glossary, the terms, specific terms, to a minimum. But again, not all, but many of the rubrics felt the need, though, to make sure to clarify certain terms that were essential in the actual descriptions and performance descriptors of the second page of the rubric. And so that's why glossaries are sometimes included. The back page or second page of each of the rubrics follows this format, and it has three basic components to it: a set of criteria that go down the left-hand column. These are the things that the development teams found when they began to look at rubrics that had already been developed by faculty and colleagues across the country related to the particular learning outcome. They also drew upon research at various centers and from scholars around each of these learning areas to try to identify the key concepts, the key criteria, the characteristics that were looked for and that were essential for anyone to be able to demonstrate the learning outcome that they were examining and looking at. Through this process, they came up with long lists of criteria and then went through the process, partly in the testing of it on the campuses, to narrow that set of criteria to a smaller set of core or critical criteria or dimensions of learning for each of the outcome areas. And the feedback from campuses during the testing was the most that we can keep in our heads and that we can handle for each of these outcomes is somewhere between 5 or 6 criteria, independent criteria. And so that's why each of these will have typically 5 or 6 criteria that have been lifted up as critical. The second part of each of the rubrics are the levels of performance. Again, these rubrics were developed at a general level. Quite frankly, they were originally developed with a notion of students gathering their work into some type of portfolio over the entire arc of their educational pathway or progress, so that one could, and the student could, and the institution and the faculty could look at that learning over time and see the growth and development of the learning on each of the criteria during the student's educational experience. And the second part of the levels was that we would, with that second column following the criteria, start with what we ended up labeling capstone level of performance, which was a level at which we would love to see all of our students if they were to graduate with a baccalaureate degree. So starting with where we would like students to be at the end of their undergraduate educational career. And from that point then, working back to key points and key ways in which students would be developing their skills and abilities to get to that place. Because if we don't have a notion of where we want our students to be at the end, we can do anything that we want to do, and students will meander around and it'll just be fine, which is how many of us have approached it as when we were in the classroom and as we put our programs together as collections of courses and pieces that have not really been tied together in the context of trying to help our students get to an agreed upon and shared position at the end of their career. The first part of it, the one at the far right, we labeled benchmark, was again not college ready. They said we don't want to go there, but what we can do is that we can look at where how our students who are entering our institutions through whatever doorway and at whatever point are performing when they come to us. How are they demonstrating their learning? What is the characteristics that they are demonstrating at that point? And so the benchmarks were really how students sitting in the classrooms in the organizations that these developers were engaged with on a day-to-day basis were demonstrating their learning and the characteristics of that. The milestones are simply not nice, neat, equally stepped progress along the line, but rather key ways in which milestones along the way that we could see, students could look to, that shows that they are making progress toward moving from where they are to where we would like them to be at the end of their undergraduate journey. The third part of each one of the rubrics are indeed the performance descriptors. These are the articulations that most of us as educators have in our heads of what the learning needs to look like. But here they tried to articulate them in the context of what would it look like when we saw it? What does it look like? What do we look for to give us an indication that students are performing at a level that we would expect them to be at? And that therefore focused on verbs. They wanted it to be observable, to be something that could indeed be looked at and others could look at it. And so it meant that students had to be doing something the verbs were important. The teams did not work off of Bloom's taxonomy, either the old or the newer version of it, as a key guiding principle, but rather did use it as a general reference to try to move our students from verbs that ask them at a benchmark level to describe or to list to something more toward the end where they were having to evaluate, to synthesize, and do higher order kinds of skills and abilities, rather than having the levels reflect doing something once and then doing it twice and then doing it 3 times, or the reverse of that, not doing it so often in terms of errors, but rather to make qualitative leaps and distinctions in the development of the student learning, not just quantitative nature, and to make it articulated as much as possible. Again, part of this is the general nature of these is reflected in the fact that the language that is there was an amalgam. It was a collaboration and a consensus of faculty who were at Research One institutions, community colleges, private liberal arts colleges, faith-based institutions, comprehensive institutions. So it represents no single sector of higher education, no single elite or open access institution, but rather tried to capture the generic underlying kinds of things that one would look for in terms of the learning. Following along with this, there's another set of questions that seem to cluster around these notions about interpretation, application of the rubrics because of how they were developed at this more institutional and programmatic level. Do the performance levels, the 4, 3, 2, 1, correspond to year in school? No, they do not. And what about letter grades? No, they do not reflect letter grades. Initially, we actually started with 6 levels of performance, and the faculty testing those with their own work on campuses said that's too many, too fine a set of distinctions to make at this general level. And so we need to reduce it, and we went with 4. We knew that if there were 5 levels there, that there would be this regression to the mean, and so people would be likely to end up focusing on the middle. And they felt very strongly that people should be making a choice here about the level that they're seeing. And again, it's not year in school, even though it does look to the end of an undergraduate career, which we traditionally have thought about as a 4-year progress. Because think about your own learning. And as you move from something that you're very good at into trying to do something that is new to you, it's a new experience, it's a new arena, it's a new subject area, your learning is not going to be as sophisticated. You're not going to demonstrate the same high level of learning that you may in an area that you have focused on before and that you're comfortable with, that you like and that you've got a background in. And so even seniors may be performing at a 1 or a 2 level when they enter into a new arena. just as folks who come into an institution and perform in some areas at a 1 or a 2 level may actually be excelling at a 3 or a 4 level, entering into an institution because they're bringing experience, they're bringing background from another context that allows them in that arena to show a more advanced and sophisticated level of learning. So no to both of those things. Can an assignment be scored by someone whose expertise is different than the content covered in the assignment? Our response to that is yes. And again, most of us have heard this in one way or another. Well, I'm a philosophy professor and I can't score a paper from biology. What our developers were really trying to do was to get at the underlying characteristics that spanned and cut across disciplinary and content arenas. Yes, they may need to be expressed differently depending upon the subject area or the general area of focus, but there are underlying aspects of it that around analysis or synthesis or description or comparison or whatever that are common capacities and abilities that students need to develop. Some institutions have indeed where they've been too very concerned about specific content dimensions of assignments, have sometimes offered an answer key, particularly in more technical fields, so that folks can get over the content part. We say go on the assumption the content is right and look then for those underlying principles. It's also part of why we do not start with assignments, the actual prompt for the assignment, because it immediately leads us in the direction of grading, which is what we as faculty are used to doing, is how well did they answer the assignment, but rather to get us to really try to focus not on that part of it, but on whether or not the student is demonstrating the capacities that are listed in the rubric. Can these be used at 2-year institutions, since they're really talking about at the end of a baccalaureate? Yes, 2-year faculty and educational professionals help develop these. It was always conceived of as a 2-year and a 4-year, a rubric that can be used at both. And you will have some students who will accomplish 4 levels regardless of the institution early in their educational pathways in certain areas, and in others not. And so yes, 2-year institutions use these rubrics, they help develop them, and that's part of the point of it. It covers the entire arc. Can they be used in graduate programs? They weren't designed as such, but we have examples of many institutions that have taken the value rubrics and built from them into their master's and even into their doctoral and professional programs, building on the same conception of criteria and taking it to an even more advanced level. And finally, can the value rubrics be used for course level assessments? The answer is yes, but they should be modified or adapted to include the specifics of the language, the concepts, the content of that area. The value rubrics in and of themselves are probably too generic to be used at the course level, because there you're also looking for something that you can use for grading. And so as a result of that, they indeed need to be adapted and modified. And we do have some examples that Ashley will reference later on where campuses have been doing that, and some examples of how they have done that. Ashley?
Thanks, Terry. So those are a list of commonly asked questions. We do get those quite a lot, and I'm guessing as you continue your own campus work, those might have already popped up in some of your conversations, or they likely will. So sometimes it's nice having at least some kind of response to see if that plays out in that context. And here's the next one that we get quite a bit is giving students a rubric, essentially the same as giving them the answer. Giving students a vision for what you're looking for. Does that mean students will automatically be able to do it? And this one is one that I thought might be best explained by a couple of pictures, or at least the way that we consider it. And one thing is to think of any other kind of skill that we engage in daily life, and one of those is something like baking. So for example, if I were to give you all a picture and a recipe to do something, does that mean that you'd be able to recreate the recipe? And chances are, depending upon how good of a baker you are, it's probably more likely to end up looking like this. And if we have any fans of Pinterest out there, there's a whole section of that on that website that you can Google called Pinterest fails and craft fails, and they're pretty funny, first of all, but it's a great representation of skills in all ways and shapes and forms, whether those are learning capacities or different kinds of skills. And of course, I suppose everything's sort of a learning capacity in that sense. But get better over time. But having just the picture, having the vision for what's expected is so critical for even beginning to accomplish what you're expected to accomplish by the end. So that's why we say that giving the rubric isn't the same as giving the picture. What you actually have are multiple dimensions in which students would have to perform at across multiple dimensions. The same with baking. Multiple things go into baking and having cookies look and taste as good as you'd want them to. So it's the same in the sense of the rubric. And one of the things that it points to is how accomplished faculty and staff are at learning to think these things are easy. But in fact, it's a good reminder as we go through this process of how truly complex they are and how challenging they are for students to perform at multiple levels of development. So one of the things that we wanted to do is also think about not only the frequently asked questions, but a different sort of angle on the frequently asked questions, which is how can the rubrics be used for faculty development beyond just how you're applying the rubrics, but the ways in which they might actually facilitate conversation on campuses. And this has been, at least in Terry and I's experience working with campuses, a happy byproduct of just engaging in this form of assessment, regardless of whether the rubrics are actually implemented, that they can in multiple ways become nice conduits for developing conversation on campuses. And one of those is through simply running training sessions with the rubrics. We might call them calibration sessions or norming sessions, but really they're just spaces where you're bringing groups of faculty and staff together. You almost always interdisciplinary. We prefer that they be interdisciplinary. You'll generate the best conversations doing that. And it's when you're actually taking a rubric and applying it to a sample of student work. And we've got a process that we walk people through in doing that, and it involves digging in deeply into the rubric, asking questions about the language that's actually there. You're using it to apply to a sample of student work, but it's really all about becoming more familiar with the structure and the language within the rubric. Terry mentioned the cells in the rubric and how those are based upon what students are actually doing at any one point in time, any one point in their developmental process. So that grid actually becomes a really nice framework for engaging conversations around intentional assignment design. So thinking about the ways in which you might pull, for example, first-year seminar faculty together to take a look at assignments and focus on the ways in which students are actually being asked to engage in the content, ways in which they're being asked to demonstrate content. And when you have the rubric in front of you, then that conversation can also be around what is developmentally appropriate at that level of learning. And so is what students are being asked to do appropriate for them? And how can you think about subsequent courses in which you'd be able to increasingly be able to challenge those skills and ask students to do increasingly more complex things? And so those assignment design workshops can be a good idea. Rubric modification workshops, one of the things that we stress in training sessions is that those are not good places to actually change the rubric. And that's because we can spend a lot of time tweaking language and wordsmithing things, and so it sort of gets in the way of actually applying the rubric and thinking about what's there. But they can be great opportunities to lift up things that we might want to change later on. So rubric modification workshops are ways to bring faculty back together, maybe then at a specific program level or even for course level assessment, and think about the ways that the rubric could be modified in better ways to meet different environments or learning environments on campus, and then perhaps even for institutional level modification as well. And then finally, this too has been something in the last couple of years that I think that I have increasingly had a chance to take part in. I think it speaks to the increasing capacity on campuses to have used the rubrics have implemented the rubrics and then actually used them for gathering data. but actually bringing faculty and staff back together to talk about those data, to ask for feedback, to get ideas on what might be happening and get ideas for improvement. And so those can be fantastic ways to not only look at data, but just to celebrate the good work that's happening around assessment and the ways in which to keep improving that process. So finally, we have a few slides, or a handful of slides, specifically related to how rubric data can be aggregated, how it can be presented out. We didn't mean to present any of these slides as some definitive way to present the data, but really just to give you all a vision for what it could look like at the institutional level. There's many different ways to tell the story, and this is just one of the ways. So this is data from our good colleagues over at UNC Wilmington, looking at the critical thinking rubric. This is a summary of scores. They've zeroed in on percent of students who have scored at 2 particular levels, but I raised this or inserted this table just so you could see what it would look like to target the improvement process. So where you might in the grid identify relative areas of strength, for example, with regard to a specific sample of students or work, and then potential areas for development, and those opportunities for intentional assignment design. And I'll pass it over to Terry for some more examples on this.
Thank you. We're sticking with critical thinking rubric here, but this is at a very large research institution, and it focuses on introductory level courses that are large lecture sections there for cost efficiency and so on and so forth. And they decided that they wanted to use the value rubrics to look at student learning, but they also wanted to see if indeed they could stay within this large lecture section framework, but to approach it differently in terms of pedagogy and design. And so they engaged a team that included the faculty member, graduate students, information literacy folks from the library, as well as some IT instructional design folks, and essentially redesigned the course to include a variety of pedagogies and teaching tactics and examples, et cetera, projects, whatever, in some of the sections, and to leave the traditional lecture discussion section that had been the prevalent model in place. And so this is just another visual way of presenting the data that they found. The students were signing up as they always had, not because of the design of the course, because they didn't know that they were different, but rather because it fit their schedules. And so what they found with the critical thinking is that on the dimensions related to issues, analysis, and conclusions, that this new design heightened the levels of learning, moved students a little bit farther along in terms of the level of their learning on those dimensions of critical thinking. However, when they looked at other dimensions, such as evaluation of sources and evidence, they found that students were actually performing less well under this new design. And so what that did is it illustrated that the rubric allowed them to get information that was more finely grained to explain why students were performing better or worse, and that they had in their redesign neglected to include the kinds of things, the emphases, the assignments, the prompts that had students demonstrating the evaluation of sources and evidence that they were looking for. In addition, they also tried to look at this not just in the context of particular sections of courses, but rather the students' overall progress through the institution. So they decided to compare first-year and fourth-year students, again, which might be more useful rather than at a formative level, but for a more accountability or summative level of reporting this for accreditation purposes, et cetera. And again, we're able to take this, shifted the focus to writing. It is a summary of the entire writing rubric rather than dimensions of it. But again, to demonstrate that indeed students who went to the University of Kansas did indeed show a substantial improvement as they moved through their educational pathways. Ashley?
So since we're, again, trying to just give visions for how you might put together a narrative and how you might represent that narrative, I'd like to show these data from the LaGuardia Community College. What I like about them is, now, bear with us, because LaGuardia uses a 12-point scale, and it's slightly complex and a little convoluted, but that's what they use here. But the main point in showing you this is actually to show you the narrative, which is that rather than suggest what might be relative gains or improvements based on benchmarks, so based on, for example, setting benchmarks that 70% of students would reach a 3 by the time they graduate or something like that. LaGuardia actually reports their data in terms of overall movement, overall levels of improvement across students, and they do work with portfolios, and they are working with the rubrics. But what I like is, again, just a different way to kind of model the data that gets at the true notion of what it means to look at developmental learning over time. So being able to think about where students, or a cross-section even of students, might be at one point in time, and then just relative gains at a different time with additional credits added. For example, they're a 2-year institution, so they're just looking at students who have accumulated lower credit versus higher credit. But again, it's just another way to present the data. If you're interested in reading more and looking at more information from campuses and the ways in which they've implemented the rubrics, Terry and I put together a publication a couple of years ago, and we framed it in part around frequently asked questions, but have gathered, put the chapters together in such a way to get at a number of key issues, for example, reliability and validity of the rubrics, how to use signature assignments, e-portfolios, and we matched it up with 12 case studies and gathered some data and some information from what's happening on campuses to sort of contextualize those chapters as we went through. That's all well and good, but I would actually encourage you just to look at the case studies themselves, and those case studies are available online. They're just about 3 pages long, so if you just want to read how campuses or campus folks have put their work into their own words, you will find case studies on how the rubrics were implemented, how data was gathered and then used for the improvement process. And this is a pretty diverse set of institutions that reported here. So just wanted to let you know that both of those resources are out there, and in particular the case studies, because they're easily downloadable. And with that, we have about 10 or so minutes left, and I will just go ahead and turn it over to all of you for your additional questions. People actually have been asking questions as we've been going through. We've been trying to keep up with those as best we can, but there might be more out there, so we can entertain those as well. Terry, I don't know if you want to add anything at this point either.
No. Thank you for posing your questions, but we encourage you to pose more. This webinar, like the ones that preceded it, will be posted on the SHIO website by, I don't know when, but soon, and so it'll be there as a resource for others to listen in on, etc., if you wish. Okay, here's a question. A sample rubric without going through the checkout. Can you get one without going through the checkout?
Unfortunately, no.
Yeah. We apologize for that, but it seemed to be the only way that the system that we have here at AAC&U. The other thing, though, is that if you can get your hands on one of the publications, the gray one, it has all of the rubrics in the back of it, with the exception of the global rubric, which wasn't developed at the time that was published. And if you are a member of AAC&U, your provost's office, or you can find out, at least from our website, who your representatives are on your campus, and they should all have copies of these publications, which are routinely sent to each of the member campus representatives. So you could always Xerox and copy it if you wish.
The other quick thing I'll mention is that we are moving to a new website soon, and we do hope to sort of smooth out that process. It's a slightly clunky right now, which is, I'm sure, what's raised the question, and we are hoping to smooth that out with the launch of the new website. So please bear with us, and we are really going to try and make it better. We have another additional question that is, I know you addressed this, but I have always understood these rubrics for course of study evaluation. I still don't really see how they can be used to code assignments. I'm not sure that I'm interpreting code assignments correctly. I'm not sure if that means assignment design that we were referring to earlier. Terry, is that how you're interpreting that?
No, I actually was reading it as how can you use them to look at an individual student assignment.
Okay.
If they were originally designed for
okay.
the arc of the student.
You're right on that
okay.
one. So go ahead and respond, Terry.
Well, quite frankly, it's an excellent question, Margie, and what we find with norming, and when we do norming or calibration sessions on campuses, we typically use a single piece of student work. And that is to be able to demonstrate how the rubric can be used and to help faculty and other educational professionals who are part of that norming process to understand how to look at a piece of work and to use the rubric to get at those underlying capacities, skills, and abilities that the rubric is trying to tease out or to focus the attention on, the kinds of things that students need regardless of the content area. And so it is more difficult because you've only got one piece to look at, and often it's a relatively short piece. But we do that in order to be able to help facilitate learning about the use of the rubric and how it can be used, and to demonstrate, which typically does occur, the high level of agreement that we have among faculty from different disciplines and areas when it comes to trying to look at a basic level of work, even based solely upon a single example. We do indeed believe that the most effective use of these is indeed to look at work over time, and also the rubrics are helpful for students to look at their own work over time so that they can begin to see how and look back on their work and see how they're growing and developing in their own skills and abilities. So it's not a very good, satisfying answer. Again, it's part of what's evolving and what's happening in practice. The reality is we often don't have a portfolio of student work. We have a single piece, but that actually is we have found it to be quite helpful, even for one single piece of work, to be able to have scorers be able to see the level at which they actually can talk about and agree upon the basic level of work being demonstrated by the student in that instance. And it at least allows over time those individual instances to be accumulated into a larger picture. What would you add, Ashley?
That sounds great to me. Yeah. I wouldn't add anything. That sounds good.
One last thing from...
Great. Fire away. Mm-hmm. So we have a statement coming in that says that, from Margie, it says, we haven't imagined at this time asking faculty to create new assignments. There hasn't been enough time. So we will be asking for existing assignments that we hope will work with the rubric. I think I see where you're going with this. This seems to make it even harder, right? Yep. It does. It does. And actually, we have had lots of conversations about this with the sampling team and even the assignment design team over on the faculty development subgroup for this project. Here's one of the blanket things I would say is many of the approaches that we're taking with the multi-state collaborative and the pilot study are exactly the same approaches we would take with a campus. At the end of the day, this has to work on your own campus for the work to be ongoing. We're thrilled that we have the funding to start this project, but we have every sense that this is an ongoing effort with assessment that will just keep going. And so we really want it to make sense for campuses. That said, most campuses have to start exactly the way that you're suggesting, Margie, exactly in the sense of reaching out to faculty, meeting them where they are, saying, we know that you do these things in your courses. Where do you think you're being intentional about meeting students' critical thinking or engaging them in the writing process or thinking about their quantitative literacy? And the pilot study is simply about developing a process for sampling, for uploading artifacts, for gathering capacity of scorers, not to actually do the scoring, but to gather capacity to do those things. So it will not fall down on the representativeness of the samples, for example. We have tried to build sampling parameters that will help with that, but we know that there's a learning curve here. And the last thing I'll add is that it's so critical for faculty to understand why assignments don't work. And that can only happen after they've submitted assignments, looked at the existing assignments that they're already using, and been able to engage in those conversations with their colleagues, maybe in a faculty, in a development workshop. So we would say go with what you've got and try to improve on what you have.
And let me just add that in the guidelines that are there and available on the SHIO website, it also indicates that part of what we'll be trying to collect from faculty is to look at the relevant learning outcome rubric and to indicate which of the criteria that assignment was, in their mind, designed to address. And so they'll be able to identify dimensions of it that they had not had in their own minds when they put that assignment together. Now we're going to be asking our scorers to score using the entire rubric for all of the assignments. But what this will allow us to do is exactly what Ashley was referring to, is begin to show how assignments can be modified, could be tweaked to include other dimensions that weren't covered originally, or to actually demonstrate that students have developed an ability to address and to talk about and to demonstrate learning in a more robust way than the assignment was actually asking for, which is wonderful news for us around our students' learning, because they're getting it. They're getting it somewhere, or they brought it with them. And so that's also useful to know. And so we find that it does indeed engender some really rich and robust conversations that allow faculty to then have a much better and easier time of thinking about the assignments they already have and how they might want to tweak or modify those going forward. Well, we seem to have run out of questions, and we're also seemingly running out of time. I would like to thank SHIO for hosting this webinar. And again, encourage everyone, if you haven't made use of the SHIO website and clicking on the Multi-State Collaborative link that's on their front page, the whole set of resources and things are there that will help with our work in the Multi-State Collaborative. I guess we turn it back to you, Chris.
Well, thank you, Terry, and I don't have any further business, so with that, we'll say thank you to all our